I had arrived at the station early in January, bundled in layers that left me stiff but warm, aware that every movement carried a weight in the Arctic cold. The wind was already slicing across the valley, carrying fine shards of ice that clung to the seams of my gloves and scratched at exposed skin. Denali's slopes were distant shadows, barely visible beyond the white haze, and I could feel the emptiness pressing before I even set foot inside the small metal research outpost. We were three, me, Thomas, and Elise, each with tasks assigned for the week. Our mission was simple in theory: measure snowpack and assess avalanche risk. But the remoteness, the weather, and the isolation made every step more precarious than the routine suggested. I had been trained, I reminded myself, but training never fully accounts for the Arctic's indifference. The first night, the wind rattled the station like a living thing. I lay in my sleeping bag listening to the vibrations in the walls, counting seconds between gusts to judge the storm's rhythm. Occasionally, a small panel groaned, metal contracting and flexing, but no one spoke. Communication lines were weak, radio crackling with static whenever we tried to reach base. I told myself that was normal, that these things happened, yet I felt my chest tighten each time the storm drowned out even the sound of my own thoughts. The cold didn't just touch my skin. It pressed into my consciousness, making my mind rigid, taut, alert to everything, even the smallest scrape of ice or whisper of wind. By the second morning, snow had piled high against the walls and windows, reducing the world outside to a blurred wash of white. Visibility was near zero, and the only proof of the ground beyond our station was the trail we had dug the day before. We rotated tasks methodically. Thomas checked the external sensors, Elise worked on recording data inside, and I organized samples, the routine a fragile attempt at normalcy. I had noticed the storm warning from base, minor in their reports, but it was obvious to me now that it had been underestimated. The landscape itself seemed alive, relentless, shaping every movement with wind and cold, threatening to erase us if we strayed. That evening, when it was my turn to check the exterior sensor line, I bundled into every layer, snow boots crunching into the hardened drifts outside. The wind tore at my hood and face shield, and the gusts made my progress uneven, forcing me to plant each step carefully. I reached the first sensor, brushed snow away, jotted notes quickly, then realized Thomas hadn't returned from his own check. I assumed he had gone further along the ridge. I waited, scanning the white void, listening for anything, the faint hiss of wind, the scrape of snow, but nothing. Eventually, I returned inside, brushing off ice that had formed on my sleeves, telling myself he was fine, likely just slowed. Night fell again, darker and deeper than the first, snow piling like waves against the station. That's when the panic began. Thomas never returned. At first, I told myself I would find him in the morning, that the storm would ease. But in the hours that followed, I noticed tracks in the snow. Footprints, his, I knew instantly, emerged from the drifts outside the entrance, led right to the station, then stopped at the door. No one was inside. The door was locked, supplies untouched. I stared at the footprints as if they might explain themselves, but they led to nothing, ended abruptly in the whiteness. My hands trembled as I tried to think clearly. The storm was relentless, muffling every other sound, amplifying my own breathing, the creak of the floor, the hollow moan of wind against the walls. I forced myself to move, grabbing a snow shovel and trying to dig a path clear. Snow fell with each scoop, heavy, cold, unyielding. As I cleared an area near the tracks, my shovel struck a depression in the snow that hadn't been there before, shallow, irregular, off the path where footprints suggested Thomas should have been. My stomach tightened. I dug carefully, knowing any misstep could collapse fragile drifts or hide evidence further. The depression wasn't deep, maybe only a foot, but it was enough to suggest a body might have been here, then removed or buried by drifting snow. My mind raced with impossible scenarios, yet I returned to logic. I couldn't panic, not here, not in this wind, not alone. Hours passed. Every sound became a threat. The wind's howl carried echoes that weren't there, or perhaps they were, and I just couldn't place them. The roof groaned under snow weight. Windows bulged with pressure. Time seemed elastic. Minutes stretched into hours. I tried to measure the snowfall, check the instruments, but every step required balance, awareness, vigilance. The station felt smaller, claustrophobic. My own movements seemed exaggerated, heavy with fear. Sleep was impossible. Any moment, any step outside, could end in being swallowed by the white. By the third day, snow had built to the roofline, and the storm had not relented. We were out of communication. No one could come. I tried to ration supplies, water melting from ice in small containers, food measured carefully. Outside, the landscape was uniform, relentless, offering no landmarks, no escape. I considered leaving the station, climbing out into the wind, but logic held me back. Without visibility, without clear footing, a single misstep could bury me too. The mountain was indifferent. I realized fully then that Denali could erase a person in moments. Wind, snow, ice, unforgiving and absolute. On the fourth day, the storm lightened briefly. I dug the path again, trying to follow the tracks that seemed to reappear with every clearing. They always led to the station, always stopped, always ended in nothing. My body was exhausted, muscles burning from shoveling, layered clothing soaked with melting snow, but I couldn't stop. Each time I stepped outside, the cold bit deeper, hands stiffened despite gloves, vision blurred. I realized Thomas might already be gone. The mountain doesn't wait, doesn't negotiate, and if someone falls out of its careful attention, they vanish. The footprints were cruel, proof that someone had been here, and also that they were no longer here. By the fifth day, the storm finally broke. The sun glinted weakly on untouched snow, and the wind eased to a steady moan rather than a roar. I stepped outside cautiously, scanning the horizon. Tracks led only to the station. I followed the depression again, fully uncovered now, shallow, inconclusive. No body, no sign of struggle. Just snow, drifting lightly in the weak sun, a reminder of how quickly it could conceal everything. I marked the area, photographed it, recorded coordinates. Rescue teams reached us later, skidding over ice and snow, asking questions, looking for Thomas. There was nothing to find except the footprints, the depression, the relentless white. I left the mountain slowly, carrying a pack heavier with absence than with supplies. The storm had shown me how fragile human presence is against the Arctic, how quickly a life can vanish, leaving only suggestion, evidence eroded by wind and snow. Back in town, warm and dry, I realized the blizzard hadn't needed to be violent to be horrifying. Its silence, its white monotony, its patience were enough. It erased, it hid, and it taught me that the mountain's scale and indifference could reduce even careful preparation to insignificance. I never forgot the footprints returning to the station. I never forgot the hollow depression in the snow. I never forgot the slow realization that Thomas had ceased to exist in a place that did not notice, did not care, did not stop. The mountain keeps its secrets, and I had seen one. I left the trailhead just before dawn, carrying everything I thought I might need for a day alone on the Wasatch slopes. The sky was gray, thick with clouds that promised snow, and the air had that clean, metallic bite that always set my nerves on edge in winter. My pack was heavy but balanced. Ice axes secured, crampons strapped to my boots, a rope coiled and clipped. I had tested all this gear at lower elevations, in calmer conditions, but today was meant to be a trial in isolation, a rehearsal for the real expedition. The mountain was empty, and the wind whispered across the ridges, as if warning me to turn back. The ascent began steadily. My steps left prints that disappeared almost instantly under the soft coating of fresh snow. I followed a familiar route at first, the ridgeline twisting up through exposed rock and powder-filled gullies. The snow underfoot was deceptively stable, but I stayed alert, tapping the ice axe in front of each step to gauge the hidden layers beneath. Each time I sank slightly, I remembered that winter snow can change in seconds from firm to fragile. The clouds pressed closer, and the light turned the world to white, a blank sheet that removed all depth perception. Hours in, the wind increased. I could feel it push against me from the ridge, biting at my cheeks and prying at the seams of my jacket. The first flakes fell heavily, then blurred into a flurry that filled the air and swept away all traces of my path. My compass became a lifeline. I set it on the bearing toward the next plateau, trusting the needle more than my eyes. But the snow was relentless, and every few minutes I had to recheck my route. My legs were tiring, my lungs burning from the thin air and cold, and the silence around me was broken only by the hiss of wind and the crunch of my boots. Then I heard it, a distant rumble that rolled across the mountainside and settled in my chest. A slope nearby shuddered, and a wall of snow broke loose, racing downward with a roar that was nothing like thunder. I froze, heart pounding, waiting for it to fade, but the sound lingered, echoing in the canyons. The wind picked up, flinging ice crystals against my face. The avalanche had left its mark, burying terrain I had memorized in a white void, erasing rocks, gullies, and even my recent tracks. My stomach tightened as I realized I could no longer rely on visual cues to guide me. I continued, keeping my compass close, moving carefully, deliberately, aware of the slightest give in the snow. The storm thickened. Visibility shrank to a few meters. I could no longer see ridges or trees, only endless white. The wind threw snow in patterns that played tricks on my eyes. Shadows formed and dissolved, sometimes looking like figures rushing beside me, too fast and too fluid to be real. I told myself it was the wind, the way it curved and lifted the snow, but still my pulse spiked every time a shadow shifted near the periphery of my vision. I leaned into the rhythm of my steps, focusing on the crunch beneath my boots, the point of my ice axe in the snow, the steady direction of my compass. Hours passed. The cold gnawed at my fingers and face. My body was tired, but stopping was dangerous. The snow could bury me if the wind piled it wrong, and losing momentum in zero visibility meant disorientation or worse. I realized I had been following a slope I thought would lead upward, but it didn't feel right. The terrain beneath me seemed to repeat itself. Small rock outcroppings appeared, then vanished, the ridges curling back in ways I did not remember. My gut tightened. I was walking in a loop along the avalanche path, circling a slope that had already released its weight in snow. The thought of exposed cliffs ahead made my heart skip. One wrong step in these conditions could mean falling into a void that might never be found. I paused, dropped to one knee, and set both ice axes in the snow to brace myself. I traced the compass bearing again, marking it against the few features I could make out. Each time I lifted my head, the snow had shifted, the wind had sculpted new forms, and the world around me had changed. I was both on and off the path I had intended. My stomach churned with adrenaline. The sensation of moving forward while potentially heading toward a cliff was terrifyingly precise. Every decision mattered, every misstep could be fatal. I started to descend cautiously along what I calculated was the edge of the slope. The snow had hardened into unexpected ridges, and I had to test each step, probing with my ice axe. My crampons bit in, but I felt the subtle give that reminded me the mountain was not forgiving. The wind howled through the gullies, carrying fine ice that scoured my face. My eyes stung, and my fingers were nearly numb despite my gloves. I reminded myself to breathe, to measure each step, to trust only the tools and knowledge I had. At one point, I lost balance slightly and dug my axes into the snow instinctively. The sheer drop I had almost stepped toward vanished under a wall of whiteness. My pulse spiked, my chest tightened, but I clung to the ridge. The realization that I had been unknowingly navigating along a precipice was sobering. The mountain felt alive in its silence, indifferent to my presence, and every movement demanded focus. I adjusted my route, hugging more solid terrain, avoiding any slopes that might slide under my weight. The storm continued for hours. My clothing was damp from ice crystals melting against my skin, the cold deep and penetrating. Exhaustion built, but stopping for long meant freezing, so I forced myself onward. I relied on the compass and memory of the slope's angles, picking markers that could barely be seen through the snow. Small rocks, unusual dips, the sound of wind changing as it hit walls of ice, all became critical signs. I began to notice the subtle rhythm of the mountain, the way snow shifted, how wind carved channels and drifts, the thin line between solid ice and dangerous powder. Eventually, the wind began to ease, and the snow slowed. I emerged onto a small plateau, the storm still thick but less violent. I sank to my knees and exhaled, feeling the weight of hours spent navigating near death. The world was still white, still blinding, but the sense of immediate danger had passed. I consulted my map, comparing what I remembered to what remained visible. I was slightly off course, but from here I could descend to lower slopes where familiar trails would guide me back to the trailhead. The descent was slower, careful, each step deliberate. The snow had compacted in some areas and remained loose in others. I stayed alert, knowing the mountain could still punish a single lapse in attention. By late afternoon, the ridge opened into a tree line, the forest muffling the wind. The snow was still deep, but the danger of cliffs and avalanche paths had faded. I followed animal tracks and old trail markers toward the parking area, muscles stiff and face raw from the cold. When I finally reached the car, I paused before unlocking the door. I checked the compass one last time, compared the maps, and exhaled slowly, letting the tension drain. The avalanche path, the endless white, the cliffs, the untrustworthy snow, all of it had tested every skill, every instinct I had. But I had survived, not by luck alone but by careful observation, patience, and respect for the mountain. I sat in the car, thawing, watching the storm continue in the distance. It was a blizzard in full force, but here at the edge, I could finally breathe. I realized that being alone in a storm like that was not about fear of what might be imagined in the snow, but fear of the real, precise dangers. The snow that could give way, the slope that could drop, the cold that could claim you if you paused too long. I had faced it, and I had come out intact. The experience left me tired, raw, and alive in a way I had never been before. The mountain was indifferent, but I had met it on its own terms, and I had survived. February in the Yukon Territory is a different world. The air is dense and biting, carrying a sharpness that cuts through even the thickest layers. I had been preparing for months, training my team and studying the route, but nothing could fully prepare me for the emptiness that swallowed the landscape once I was alone on the trail. The race had started in clear skies, the sun hanging low over the distant ridges, turning the snow into a pale gold. My dogs were eager, bodies coiled with energy, paws gripping the packed trail. I felt that familiar surge of control and anticipation, the one that comes when every animal is in sync, every command exact, and the rhythm of the sled matches the rhythm of breath and movement. By the third day, the weather had begun to turn. I noticed the clouds first, a dull gray pressing low over the peaks, swallowing the sun. The wind was subtle at first, brushing against my cheeks, but I could see the first flakes beginning to drift sideways as the afternoon stretched on. I pressed forward, relying on the trail markers and my compass, confident that the route would hold. The dogs barely noticed the snow at first. They strained against their harnesses, sniffing, tugging toward the scent of the trail beneath the ice crust, chasing the rhythm of motion more than anything else. The real storm hit without warning. A wall of white descended, folding the world into itself. The wind had picked up, thrashing through the valley like a living thing, carrying snow in dense sheets that blocked everything. The trail disappeared under a raw white canvas. I tried to rely on my compass, but even that seemed uncertain. The needle wavered, spun in little circles, as if the storm were interfering with it. I told myself it was fatigue, or perhaps the cold, playing tricks on the delicate mechanics, but a knot of unease had begun to settle in my chest. The dogs hesitated, ears flat, hackles rising in tension. I could feel the shift in their energy, the sudden nervousness that spread through the team like static. I moved cautiously, slowing the sled, scanning the flat whiteness for the faint impression of a trail. Shadows began to appear between the snowdrifts, subtle and shifting. Dark shapes at first caught in the corner of my eye, fleeting, always gone when I tried to focus. Tracks appeared in the snow, deep, uneven, not following the trail. I crouched to examine them, fingers numbed against the cold, but they led nowhere. Sometimes they ended abruptly, as if whoever, or whatever, had made them had vanished into the snow. My pulse quickened. I scanned the horizon, the snowdrifts bending and folding into one another, each one a potential hiding place. I couldn't tell if the shapes I saw were real, solid, or illusions created by the storm and my exhaustion. By late afternoon, I had lost all sense of scale. The sun was a ghost behind thick gray clouds, and the landscape had flattened into a vast, featureless expanse. My ears were straining, picking up the howl of the wind, the scraping of sled runners against ice, and at the edges of perception, a noise I could not place. It was movement, or the suggestion of it, just beyond the visible range. The dogs tensed against their lines, growling low and rigid, hackles still raised. They lunged toward empty space, barking and straining at nothing, their instincts screaming at me. I tried to calm them, my words swallowed by the wind, but the tension was contagious. My own anxiety rose, each step uncertain, every second stretching long and fragile. I had been trained for cold, for endurance, for isolation, but nothing prepared me for the way the storm made the world feel alive with hidden things. As the hours passed, the wind grew relentless. The blizzard had become a roaring wall around us, and I moved slowly, deliberately, my muscles tight with tension, my eyes scanning for landmarks that no longer existed. Every drift looked the same, every rise and hollow a mirror of the last. The snow was deeper now, hiding the trail entirely. I adjusted the sled lines, keeping the dogs tight, pulling gently against them, but even that small control felt tenuous. The shapes returned, moving just beyond the snowdrifts, black impressions in the endless white. I thought I saw eyes, brief and reflective, watching. I tried to convince myself they were the shadows of rocks or the wind forming unusual patterns in the snow, but a part of me could not let go of the thought that I was being followed. Night fell early, The gray light bled away, and the blizzard turned the world to shadow and ice. The noise of the storm changed, filling the air with a rhythm that was almost, but not quite, like movement. I could hear the runners scraping and the dogs whining, but beneath that was the sensation of another presence, a pack moving alongside us. The sound of paws or claws against hard-packed snow, just faint enough to make me question my sanity. I kept the sled close, the dogs tethered tightly, and pressed on, trying to hold the trail in my mind. The compass was unreliable, the map a blur of lines in the fading light. Every step was guided more by instinct than certainty. The cold was absolute. My hands ached beneath my mittens, my face burned from windburn, and each breath left ice in my lungs. The dogs were restless, shivering, pulling in different directions, reacting to scents and movements I could not perceive. I stayed on the sled, feeling the pull and resistance, keeping my attention on the trail and the animals. Hours passed without change, the blizzard swallowing everything in a white roar. I could feel fatigue press in, a creeping numbness that dulled my senses and made every shadow seem alive. Somewhere deep in the night, the storm lessened. The wind dropped to a dull howl, the snow falling slower, heavier, settling into drifts that made the world solid again. I pressed on, following instinct, following the dogs, keeping them moving through the thickening snow. By early morning, the clouds began to break, the light returning weak and diffuse. I saw the outlines of familiar trees, the subtle ridges that marked the course. The trail was there, faint beneath the fresh snow, and the team surged with relief. The shapes and tracks from the night before were gone, erased by the wind and the drifted snow. I stopped only when I reached the checkpoint, the warmth of the small shelter cutting through the chill, the smell of hot food and oil lamps. The dogs collapsed, exhausted but unharmed. I watched them pant, fur damp, breathing in the safe enclosure. My own body shivered uncontrollably as I unstrapped the harnesses, each movement a relief, a confirmation that we had survived. The storm had left everything changed, but I had made it through, and the trail, once lost, was now clear beneath our feet. I did not speak. I did not need to. The race had pushed me to the edge, stripped away certainty, and left me with only the raw, unyielding reality of cold, isolation, and the will to keep moving. There was no hidden threat, no supernatural force, only the storm, the shapes it created, the uncertainty of snow and wind. Yet the experience remained, etched in the rhythm of my muscles, the tension in the dogs' bodies, the lingering unease of having been alone in a world that refused to yield. I rested then, letting the warmth seep into my frozen limbs, feeling every detail of the blizzard linger in my mind, a memory of the vast, indifferent silence of the Yukon and the fragile thread of survival we had followed through it. December 2015, northern Montana, Highway 2. I had left early in the morning, hoping to make it to my parents' house before dark. The plan was simple, a long solo drive through the plains, slower than the interstate, with plenty of stops to photograph the snow-covered fields and the skeletal trees lined with frost. The sky had been clear when I started, pale and washed with early winter light. The air in the car smelled faintly of coffee and the pine-scented candle I had left burning on the dashboard, though most of it had gone out. The road was empty, stretching straight across miles of frozen earth, and the snow crunched sharply under my tires. I felt the kind of calm that comes from being alone in a world stripped down to white and gray, like everything else had been erased. By late afternoon, clouds had gathered low over the horizon, thickening the light and dulling the colors. I noticed the wind picking up as I passed a series of small crests, and loose snow swirled across the highway. It was still manageable, still beautiful, and I thought about pulling over to take pictures of the drifts forming along the fence lines. I had a sense that the storm might build, but I told myself I had time. I'd seen storms come and go in the photos I had taken before. I assumed it would be the same, that I could plan around it. I was wrong. Within an hour, visibility dropped dramatically. The wind had grown sharp, slamming against the car with sudden bursts that made it rock slightly in its lane. Snow fell hard, horizontal, and the road beneath the tires disappeared under a thick, shifting layer. I tried to stay calm, reduce speed, and look for a place to pull over. There was nothing, no turnouts, no shoulders, just a narrow stretch of black ice covered in snow, and the faint glint of reflectors that disappeared as soon as the flakes accumulated on them. I realized the blizzard was moving faster than I had expected, faster than my ability to respond. I finally spotted a slight widening in the road, enough for the car to sit off the asphalt. I angled into it, slowed, and killed the engine. For a few minutes, I sat in silence, listening to the storm rage, thinking I could wait it out. The snow was relentless, like powdered concrete, and it piled along the sides of the car as if the earth itself was closing in. Within 10 minutes, it had begun to build around the tires, shaping walls of ice and snow that trapped me in place. The car was no longer just parked. It was enclosed, solidly held by the weight of the storm. I had underestimated how quickly the snow could rise, and how thin my margin for movement had been. I tried to start the car, first once, then again, then a dozen times, the engine coughing and groaning before finally turning over, but the tires spun uselessly, digging into the snow without traction. My hands were numb despite gloves, and my forehead stung from the wind blasting through the barely closed windows. I had a shovel, packed into the trunk for photography stops, and I began digging, swinging and scraping until my arms burned, but the snow kept falling faster than I could clear it. I realized that hours would be spent this way, that this was a fight I might not win alone. The car stayed mostly still, and every attempt to inch forward ended in spinning tires and frustration. The isolation began to press on me. The wind muffled all sounds but its own, a constant roar, and every time I looked outside through the frosted windshield, the highway was a blur. Shapes emerged and vanished in the whiteout. Sometimes it was just the outlines of snowbanks, but occasionally I was certain I saw figures at the edge of the road, tall, still, watching me. They did not move with the wind, did not change, just stood. I convinced myself they were trees, telephone poles, the shapes of highway signs distorted by the storm. Still, I could not shake the feeling that I was being observed. The mind does strange things when you are exhausted, cold, and trapped in silence. I worked in cycles, dig, start, spin, stop, rest, repeat. I checked my phone, no signal. The car heater ran, but the effort of running the engine in low traction made it stall repeatedly. Hours passed like this, and the daylight, once fading, vanished entirely into gray. By the time darkness fully settled, the storm was relentless, an unbroken wall of white. My fingers had gone completely numb, and my legs ached from crouching and digging. I was wet from condensation inside the car, and cold from the constant loss of heat. My eyelids drooped despite my efforts to stay alert. Every shadow outside seemed alive, every movement in the wind magnified in my mind. I knew that staying in the car was the only safe choice, but fear and exhaustion pressed against me. Eventually, a dim glow appeared in the distance. At first, I thought it was another illusion, a trick of the storm, but the light grew closer, red and white, oscillating. A Montana Highway Patrol truck emerged from the blizzard, lights flashing. Relief hit me harder than the cold ever could. I waved frantically, my movements stiff and clumsy, and the truck eased toward me, stopping with tires half buried in snow. The officers helped dig the car out, guided it back onto the cleared strip of highway, and eventually we made it to a nearby rest area. They checked my condition, ensured I was warm, and gave me blankets. The storm continued outside, furious, but I was no longer alone. I watched the swirling snow through the windshield, my breathing slowing, my body finally able to relax. The memory of that blizzard lingers. The isolation, the walls of snow, the brief moments when I thought the shapes outside were figures, remained sharp in my mind. There was no supernatural element, only the storm and my vulnerability in it. Yet it left an impression deeper than anything else I had experienced. Northern Montana in winter is beautiful, but it is also merciless. You can plan, you can prepare, and still find yourself trapped, small and fragile in the expanse of snow and wind. The patrol officers drove me to a motel nearby. I spent the night wrapped in blankets, shaking, yet conscious of the lessons learned. Respect the weather, respect the isolation, and respect how quickly the world can change when the storm arrives. By morning, the highway was again visible, tracks of vehicles etched in the snow like reminders that the world goes on, but the emptiness of the previous hours, the way the blizzard held me, the way the whiteout could make familiar roads alien, has stayed with me. Every time I drive through northern plains in winter, I remember those walls of snow and the feeling of being utterly alone, surrounded by cold and wind, and how the simplest landscape can turn into a silent, overwhelming test of endurance. I remember driving out of Sacramento early on a Friday morning, the city still fogged with December chill, the air faintly smelling of exhaust and wet asphalt. I had convinced myself that the weekend in the Sierra Nevada would be exactly what I needed: quiet, snow, and nothing but my camera and a friend for company. The cabin had been a last-minute booking, a rustic little place tucked into the woods near Donner Pass. I didn't know much about the area, only that it was remote, and that appealed to me. My friend and I loaded the car with cameras, lenses, a small stack of groceries, firewood, and sleeping bags. The drive up was long and winding. At first the roads were clear, wet but manageable, lined with pines heavy with frost. By the time we reached Truckee, snow had begun falling thick and steady, coating the ground in a quiet white that made the town feel like it was holding its breath. The last stretch of the road to the cabin was unpaved and narrower than I expected, with banks of snow creeping over the edges. The snowfall was heavier than the weather report suggested, and the wind blew in sharp gusts that made the car shudder. Visibility was dropping, and by the time we turned onto the final path, the snow was already piled high on either side of the track. Our tires slipped, gravel and ice skittering under them, and I had to maneuver carefully to avoid the edges. Eventually, after what felt like hours, we reached the cabin. It sat small and wooden against the backdrop of tall pines, the roof already half covered with snow. I pulled the car close, and we shoveled a narrow path to the door, our boots sinking with each step. Inside, the cabin smelled of cold wood and dust. The fireplace had a small stack of wood and kindling, enough to get us started, and there were a few blankets and a table for meals. We dropped our bags, lit the fire, and settled in. Outside, the snow continued to fall, layering the trees and burying the path we had shoveled. By the time we unpacked our gear and got a fire going that could last the evening, the world outside had disappeared beneath white. I stepped to the window and watched it drift down in thick flakes, and it was beautiful, almost hypnotic. But there was a weight to it too, a heaviness that made me uneasy. The wind pressed against the walls, and the forest beyond looked stark and silent. That night, we ate a small dinner of pasta and canned vegetables. The fire crackled, but the warmth barely reached the corners of the room. I kept checking the window, scanning the white haze outside. The snow had already piled to the bottom of the window frame. The cabin felt snug at first, but as the hours passed, a quiet anxiety settled over me. The wind picked up in gusts, rattling the shutters. At some point, I heard it, a soft scratching on the exterior walls. At first I thought it was a branch pressed by the wind, but the sound was deliberate, slow, moving across the boards. My friend didn't notice, or pretended not to, but I couldn't shake it. I stayed awake longer than I planned, keeping my camera by my side, peering through the tiny gaps in the frost-laced window. Shadows shifted outside, larger than any tree, moving against the white backdrop. I convinced myself they were just the trees swaying, snow sliding off the branches, but the unease stuck with me. The next morning, we tried to clear more of the snow to make a path to the road. It was harder than we imagined. The snow was already halfway up the cabin walls in places, and the shovel barely made a dent. We checked our supplies. Not much food left. We rationed what we had, small portions for each meal, trying to stretch our cans of beans and dry pasta over the weekend. Every trip outside was brief. The cold cut through layers, the wind whipping sharp needles of ice across exposed skin. Even standing by the car to brush off the roof, the metal biting into my gloved hands, made me grateful to return inside. The isolation was absolute. No other cabins in sight, no cars passing, no voices. Only the wind and the occasional crack of tree limbs breaking under snow. By the second night, the storm had worsened. Visibility was almost zero outside, the snow forming small drifts against the door. The fire burned low, and we had to keep adding wood to maintain warmth. Hunger gnawed quietly in the pit of my stomach. Sleep came in fits, interrupted by coughing, shifting, and the soft scratching again. This time it was louder, more insistent, as if whatever was outside was testing the walls. I pressed my eye to the window and saw a shape moving just beyond the snow, a dark blur against the endless white. It moved quickly, then vanished behind a mound. The fear was not of monsters, not of the supernatural, but of the reality outside, cold, hunger, being trapped with nothing but the storm and whatever was prowling through it. My mind imagined every possibility, and every scenario was survival, fear, and exposure. I checked the locks again, reinforced the shutters with a chair, and tried to convince myself it was just an animal, a coyote maybe, or a loose branch. But the timing and deliberate scratches were wrong for that. By the third day, the snow had stopped falling, but the drift remained. The road was blocked completely. We tried digging again, but after a few hours, exhaustion forced us back inside. Food was nearly gone. Water from melting snow on the roof was lukewarm and bitter, but drinkable. We ate sparingly, keeping the fire going as long as possible to stave off the cold that gnawed at our fingers and toes despite gloves and socks. Every shadow from the firelight danced across the cabin walls, forming shapes and movements. My friend tried to keep busy photographing the snow-laden trees through the small window, but even he grew quiet, and I noticed him watching the walls like I did for signs of movement. The fourth night was the hardest. The scratching returned, sharper, heavier, as if something large pressed against the cabin. I could hear the hollow creak of boards bending under weight. I stayed awake, camera at the ready, listening, waiting. Hours passed like minutes, the snow outside frozen, brilliant under moonlight that barely penetrated the thick layer of clouds. Eventually, the sound stopped, and a silence settled so heavy it was oppressive. Sleep was shallow and uneasy. By morning we were weak, hungry, and covered in frost along our hairline and eyelashes from condensation and lack of proper heat. The snow outside had hardened, but there was a faint track pressed into the surface, wide, too large for any dog we had seen, moving away from the cabin toward the treeline. Late that morning, we saw headlights faint through the snow. A ranger truck had finally made it through the road, breaking a path to the cabin. The rescue felt surreal. We had survived days with near starvation, freezing cold, isolation, and fear gnawing at the edges of our minds. The truck climbed the drifted path, and we finally stepped outside, feet sinking into crusted snow. I looked back at the cabin, walls scratched and beaten, silent now. The white haze of the blizzard had gone, leaving quiet snow glimmering in the winter sun. Nothing outside had been supernatural, nothing beyond human endurance and the relentless winter, but the sense of being tested, trapped, and observed had left a mark on me. We packed into the truck, warm again, food and shelter immediately in reach, and the forest behind us returned to silence, indifferent to what had passed. I carried the memory of that cabin with me for years, the isolation, the cold, the scratching, the shadowy shapes, and it stayed with me, a reminder that nature, hunger, and solitude are capable of a kind of horror all their own. I set out early in the morning, before the sun had fully touched the peaks. The air was crisp and still, the kind of cold that bites through a thin layer of clothing and makes every breath sharp in your lungs. I had studied the route for weeks, downloaded satellite images, and memorized the ridges and gullies I would need to navigate. The goal was a lesser-known peak, one that rarely saw winter traffic, and I was drawn to it for the solitude as much as the challenge. The snow was fresh, untouched, and glittered under the weak winter light. My boots sank deep with every step, but it was worth it for the silence. No voices, no tracks, nothing but the soft hiss of snow compressing beneath my weight. At first, the climb was exhilarating. The ridge narrowed as I ascended, the wind picking up only slightly, brushing against my face. The snow was powdery, masking rocks and frozen ridges beneath it, so I moved deliberately, testing each step. The sky was clear, pale blue above the crags, and the sun warmed my neck through the layers. I felt in control, alert, and alive. I made good progress, reaching a small plateau just below the summit where I paused to check my bearings. My tracks behind me were neat and unbroken, a line leading back down the slope. By early afternoon, clouds had begun gathering. Thin at first, but spreading quickly. I noted the forecast called for a storm, but I thought I had time. The air became heavier, and the wind began to gust sharply. Snow started to fall lightly at first, drifting sideways in sudden bursts. I tightened my jacket and pulled my hood over my head. I pressed on, focused on the ridge, but the visibility shrank with every step. Within an hour, the sun was gone, swallowed by the thickening clouds, and the snowfall turned relentless. Each step forward now required more effort. Snow clung to my boots, my gait slowed, and the slope beneath my crampons became treacherous. I paused to look back, trying to pick out my tracks, but they were already fading under the fresh snow. My heart skipped as I realized that what I thought was a clear path was no longer visible. I turned, scanning for anything familiar, a jutting rock, a tree, a ridge, but everything was white, blurred by the wind. I tried to convince myself I could retrace my steps, but the ground beneath me had lost all definition. Each step now felt uncertain. The wind rose, hammering against me with a howl that sounded almost alive. I tightened my grip on the ice axe, its spike biting into the frozen crust beneath the powder. The sound of the wind masked everything else, but not entirely. There was a scraping, almost a dragging, to my side. I spun, but the whiteness held nothing. Only the wind and the snow, but something in my chest told me I wasn't alone. I moved again, slower, deliberate, scanning every shadow, every bulge in the snow. Rocks became shapes that shifted with the wind, trees or stunted pines maybe, but sometimes they looked human in the corner of my eye. I shook my head and forced my mind back to the task. Find the trail down, get off this ridge before dark. Hours passed, or maybe minutes, I couldn't tell. The blizzard erased all markers, flattened ridges, and swallowed any sense of direction. I followed what I thought were my tracks, only to lose them seconds later, snow covering every indentation immediately. The ridge twisted and turned, a jagged spine that curved back on itself, and gradually I realized I had been moving in a loop. Every rock, every slope, every wind-blown gully looked the same, until I felt my stomach tighten with panic. I was circling the same ridge, back where I had started, and there was no summit, no safe trail, only the endless whiteness and wind. Night fell without warning. The light disappeared in the gray, leaving only the muted swirl of snow and the howl of wind. My fingers were numb inside the gloves, my face a stinging burn from exposure. My mind was sluggish, fogged with cold, and I struggled to keep moving. Shadows formed in the snow around me, small mounds, gullies, jagged rocks, but sometimes they looked like figures crouching, watching. I knew they were illusions, my hypothermia feeding my brain distorted shapes, but that did little to calm the creeping terror. Every snap of a branch, every crunch beneath unseen objects made me flinch, imagining that something was following, something moving just outside my narrow vision. I stopped to rest, leaning on the ice axe, and realized my mouth was dry, my lips cracked. My boots were wet from melting snow, ice forming inside them, squeezing my toes. I shook, teeth chattering uncontrollably, and forced myself to move again. Every direction seemed identical, every ridge a mirror of the last. I tried to make mental notes of landmarks, but they vanished as soon as I blinked. The snow erased everything, reduced the mountain to an endless white void. Hours, or maybe another hour, passed. I found a small rock outcropping and dug a shallow trench, trying to shield myself from the wind. I crouched low, shivering violently, breathing fast. My legs ached, my body was stiff, and my thoughts flickered between panic and calculation. I knew I could not stay still for long. Hypothermia would take me if I did. I had to move, had to find the lower ridges, the treeline, anything resembling safety. I picked a direction and began to crawl forward. Every step was a fight against the snow and wind. The shapes continued at the edges of my vision, moving just slightly, sometimes disappearing, sometimes reappearing as vague shadows. I focused on the rhythm of my movements, counting each step, forcing myself to believe I was making progress. The wind tore at my hood, whipped snow into my eyes, and my visibility was reduced to barely 10 feet. The mountain had become hostile, indifferent, and I was utterly alone. Eventually, after what must have been hours, I noticed the slope easing, the wind losing some of its fury. Snow fell more gently, and I glimpsed dark shapes in the distance that were not shadows, not illusions, trees. The treeline. My chest lifted with relief and exhaustion. I aimed for it, stumbling, slipping, but moving steadily. The snow was deep, but the forest offered shelter, something to block the wind, a promise of warmth. I reached the edge of the trees as my legs gave out, collapsing onto a bed of pine needles, exhausted but alive. I spent the night huddled against a tree, using what little gear I had to stay warm, listening to the wind die down beyond the forest. The mountain was still out there, vast and empty, but I was off the ridge. In the morning, I found a serviceable trail carved by earlier hikers and followed it down, every step bringing clarity back to my frozen mind. By midday, I reached the edge of a dirt road, distant lights from a ranger station faint in the sunlit valley below. I was wet, sore, and drained, but safe. Looking back, the ridge seemed peaceful in daylight, the blizzard a memory of white chaos. There was nothing supernatural, no hidden predator, only the mountain and the storm and my own isolation. But the terror lingered, a deep awareness of how fragile control is when faced with such conditions. I had chased solitude and challenge, and I had found it, but only by testing the limits of endurance and sanity. The experience stayed with me long after I returned to warmth and civilization. The mountain had not changed, but I had, and the memory of that night in the blizzard would remain vivid, a reminder of how alone and small a person can be against nature's indifference. By the time I reached the ranger station, exhausted and shivering, I knew I would climb again, but never without respect for the storm and never unprepared for the silence and isolation it could impose. The memory of shapes in the snow, of the wind as a living presence, would remain, but they were lessons in vigilance and endurance, grounded in reality and my own vulnerability. I had survived, and that survival was its own clarity, its own resolution, as harsh and exacting as the mountains themselves. February 2007, Lake Superior backcountry. I had been planning this trip for weeks, a weekend escape from the constant noise and pressure of the city. Snowshoeing, long hikes through deep snow, the silence of the woods. All of it promised a kind of clarity that I rarely found in my daily life. I had 2 friends with me, neither of them experienced in winter camping. They were excited, but I could tell by the way they moved in the snow that even a short walk left them winded. I had been through similar terrain before, though never this far north along the western shore of Lake Superior. The trails were marked, but rarely maintained, and I suspected we would see little evidence of human passage this late in February. We set out in the morning, the sky a pale gray, the lake just visible through the trees on our left. The snow was thick, crisp underfoot, and our breath left clouds in the cold air. At first, everything was orderly. I led the way, breaking trail through unbroken drifts, occasionally marking our path with small ribbons of cloth tied to branches, so we could find our way back if necessary. My friends followed in single file, careful not to step off the packed trail, but it didn't take long before the markers became scarce. I knew the trail existed, but visibility was dropping faster than I had anticipated. Flurries began mid-morning, light at first, then heavier, the snow beginning to obscure not only the trail but the distant trees. By early afternoon, we had lost any sense of direction. The lake, which had been a faint guide to our left, disappeared behind a curtain of white. I stopped, trying to orient myself, but every tree looked the same, every slope identical. My friends' pace slowed, and the worry in their movements was obvious. We were in an area rarely visited, where the map I had carried was more of a suggestion than a guide. The snow was relentless, each step sinking deeper than the last as the wind picked up, carrying fine ice crystals that stung our cheeks. As evening approached, the storm became relentless. Snow fell in sheets, and the temperature dropped sharply. The world had become a blur of white, and even my experience felt inadequate. I realized then that we had no choice but to find shelter before darkness fully set in. I had scouted the area on a map and remembered an abandoned cabin not far from our approximate location. It had been deserted for decades, a relic of logging operations long forgotten. If nothing else, it would give us a place out of the wind. We moved cautiously, trying to keep sight of one another through the whiteout. The snow underfoot shifted and groaned, the wind cutting across the frozen lake with a low, haunting whistle. Every sound was exaggerated, every movement magnified. I kept glancing over my shoulder, not just for my friends, but for something else, a creeping unease I couldn't name. Occasionally, I heard something that didn't fit, the crunch of snow that didn't match our steps, the shifting of branches as if someone, or something, was moving alongside us. It was never consistent, never directly behind, sometimes ahead, sometimes circling at a distance I couldn't measure. Night came, and with it a darkness that seemed to press against the snow, dense and tangible. The storm masked our own noises, but the subtle sounds of something moving in the woods persisted. I began noticing tracks, first small ones that could have been deer, then larger impressions, elongated and irregular, set apart from any human stride. I crouched to examine them, the wind almost freezing my fingers through my gloves. The prints were enormous, the deep impressions suggesting weight and force. They weren't fresh, but recent enough to indicate that whatever had made them had been moving through the same area we were in. My friends were tense, exhausted, and mostly silent. I kept moving, insisting we stay on course toward the cabin. Each step felt heavier, each breath slower, and the cold penetrated deeper than I remembered from other winter trips. The sound of the wind off the lake had a strange quality now, echoing in ways that made the forest feel larger, more empty, more threatening. Every snap of a branch, every groan of a snow-laden tree made my heart jump. I felt the weight of attention, an awareness that we were not as alone as we had assumed when we set out. Eventually, we saw the silhouette of the cabin through the storm, black against the white landscape. The structure was small, wooden, and clearly abandoned for decades. Snow had collapsed parts of the roof, and frost covered every surface. I checked the door. It was warped and barely hung on its hinges. Inside, it was bitterly cold but shielded from the wind. The floor was layered with old debris and snow that had blown in, and the walls bore the marks of time and neglect. We settled in, making temporary bedding from our packs and huddling together. Outside, the storm continued, and the sounds of movement persisted, distant but unmistakable. I stayed near the door, listening, straining to make sense of what was there. The night was long. The wind howled across the frozen lake, snow piling against the cabin walls, and the unexplained movements continued outside. Occasionally, a heavy footfall would press against the thin floorboards nearby, or a branch would snap in a rhythm that didn't correspond to the storm. I stayed awake as long as I could, alert and tense, noting every sound, every shadow. My friends drifted into fitful sleep, trusting me, though I could sense their unease. I tried to reason with myself, reminding myself that the backcountry held large wildlife, moose, wolves, maybe even bears. Any of these could explain the sounds. But the prints, the irregular stride, the weight, they suggested something more substantial than a deer, more persistent than a wolf. By dawn, the storm had eased slightly. The light was gray and diffuse, but visibility improved. I went outside to examine the snow around the cabin. The prints we had noticed before were more evident in the morning light. They led toward the lake, large and heavy, then disappeared into the trees, as if the maker had moved off silently. I noted the tracks of smaller animals, deer and rabbits, but these prints were different, a size and depth that suggested weight and caution. Whatever had been following us had remained near enough to keep us aware, but never close enough to reveal itself fully. We packed what we could and made our way back toward the marked trails, careful to avoid the areas where the strange prints had concentrated. The snow had lightened, the wind eased, and the forest felt less threatening, though the memory of that night stayed with me. We emerged onto a maintained trail by midday, exhausted, chilled, and quietly shaken. I had led us back safely, relying on experience and instinct, but the sense of being watched and followed lingered. I never discovered exactly what had tracked us, whether it was a large predator or simply a series of misread signals, but the experience reshaped my understanding of winter wilderness. The backcountry was beautiful, silent, and unforgiving. It demanded respect, vigilance, and a readiness to accept that sometimes you are not alone, even when no one else is around. We returned home that evening, weary and quiet. The city felt overwhelming after the isolation, yet strangely comforting. That trip stayed with me, a reminder of the weight of snow, the sharpness of cold, and the vigilance required in a landscape that can appear empty, but is never truly so. I hadn't planned on staying long. I drove up from Burlington in the late morning, taking the narrow back roads that led toward the high ridges of northern Vermont, following paths I remembered from childhood. The air was sharp and dry, the kind that stings your nose and makes the lungs work harder. Snow lay thick along the shoulders of the road, unbroken except where a snowplow had passed days earlier. I knew I should have checked the forecast more carefully. In those days, I didn't imagine a storm could hit this fast. I hadn't seen the sky darken like that before noon, clouds folding down to the treetops, heavy and swollen, promising something I didn't yet understand. The cabin was deeper in the woods than I remembered, past a stretch of trail where saplings and brush had grown up around what had been a clear path. I parked where I always used to park, by a wide, half-frozen brook, and trudged through the snow, each step sinking knee-deep in places. The silence pressed against me, the kind of quiet that doesn't just muffle sound but seems to absorb it entirely. The wind began to pick up, sharp flakes spitting at my cheeks, and by the time I reached the clearing, the cabin's roof was almost invisible behind a thick curtain of white. The cabin itself looked smaller than I remembered, worn by decades I hadn't kept track of. Its logs had darkened, the paint peeling from the trim, icicles dangling from the eaves. I went around to the door, found it unlocked, and pushed inside. The smell of old wood and cold smoke hit me first. Dust rose from the floorboards with every step. I placed my pack down and ran my fingers along the edge of the fireplace mantel. The cabin felt empty but familiar, like a photograph I could almost step into. Outside, the storm was already settling in, muffling everything in a gray haze. I walked around the clearing, remembering the trees I used to mark for hunting, the small ridge where I had built a lean-to with my friends. My eyes caught a familiar birch deeper in the woods, one we had carved our initials into when we were 15. The markings were still there, faint in the frost. I traced them with my gloved hand, feeling a hollow weight in my chest. My footsteps had become the only sound besides the wind, and for a moment, it was like the forest held its breath around me. I noticed footprints leading away from the tree. They were partially covered, softened by fresh snow, not deep or sharp enough to be recent, but enough to suggest someone had passed through in the hours before the storm. My mind pulled at old memories, asking if it had been my friends, if somehow they had come back, though I knew it was impossible. By mid-afternoon, the snow had thickened. Visibility dropped to a few dozen feet. The roads were impassable. I had no way back, no cell service, nothing but the cabin and the woods. I went inside, stacking firewood, lighting the old stove, feeling the warmth grow and seep into my bones. The storm outside hammered at the windows, the wind rattling the panes like someone shaking the house. Each gust made me jump, reminded me that I was completely alone, and that no one knew where I was. I explored the cabin again, finding remnants of my visits long ago, a rusted can of beans, a dented tin cup, old nails scattered on the floor. The small pantry had been cleaned out years ago, but I had brought enough food for 2 nights. I ate slowly, listening to the storm. That quiet, endless white, the way it flattened sound and warped perception, began to play tricks on me. Sometimes I thought I heard voices carried through the wind, whispers from my childhood friends calling me back into the woods. I knew it was just the wind through the trees, but it made me pause, made me feel like I was being watched by everything I had known here years ago. Night fell, and the storm intensified. I lay in the cabin, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind tear at the roof. Then I heard it, a faint crunch in the snow outside. Not the storm itself, not the trees bending under the snow, but deliberate steps. I froze. The sound circled the cabin slowly, 1 foot in front of the other measured. My pulse spiked, adrenaline pressing against my chest. I strained my ears. I thought about opening the door, but the thought of stepping into that blinding snow, unsure where I would go, made my stomach tighten. There were no footprints leading to the cabin, nothing that would suggest anyone had actually come up here. Just the sound of movement in the snow. I couldn't tell how close they were, only that they were somewhere outside, in the night, in the storm circling. I didn't sleep. I stayed awake until the wind died down around 3 in the morning, listening to every snap of ice on branches, every groan of the cabin settling. My mind replayed old memories, faces, laughter, and the smell of cold pine, mixing with the stark white of the storm outside. I began to second-guess my own senses. Maybe it wasn't footsteps. Maybe I had imagined them. But the fear, the raw tightness in my chest, was real. I had always thought I could handle isolation. This was different. This was the kind of loneliness that presses against your brain, makes familiar places feel unfamiliar, warps the sounds you rely on. By dawn, the storm had eased to a steady fall, flakes still drifting, but no longer a wall. I stepped outside, boots sinking into snow nearly 2 feet deep. I checked around the cabin, following the edges of the clearing. The footprints were gone, swallowed by the fresh drift. The world looked soft and quiet, untouched. I walked toward the birch again, traced the initials with my fingers, and took a long, careful breath. The storm had erased almost everything. Trails, landmarks, tracks, they were all gone. What remained was memory, and the snow that had settled over it. I stayed that day, watching the sun dim through clouds, knowing the roads were still impassable. I kept the fire burning and the stove hot, moving carefully through the cabin, keeping track of food and water. I thought about leaving immediately once the storm passed, but something held me there. It was not fear exactly, but a need to reconcile the place I remembered with the place that existed now. The snow had leveled everything, turned familiar shapes into strangers, and in the quiet aftermath, I could hear the forest breathing again, the wind moving softly through the branches. By the next morning, the roads had cleared enough for me to make my way back. The tires crunched over hard-packed snow, the landscape still soft and white, distant tree lines sharp against gray sky. I glanced in the rearview mirror, remembering the footprints, the wind-carried voices, the empty cabin. I knew none of it had been supernatural. It had been memory, isolation, storm, and the fragile way the mind fills empty spaces with what it knows. Driving down the mountain road, the sun breaking through clouds, I felt a quiet satisfaction, a relief. I had faced the cold, the silence, the isolation, and returned intact. The place had changed, as had I, but the memories remained solid beneath the snow, waiting for the next time someone returned. I stopped at the edge of the forest once more, looking at the cabin through the white haze. The initials on the birch stood faint but stubborn, a reminder of the past that survived winter's erasure. I left the clearing slowly, stepping carefully on uneven snow, carrying the knowledge that the forest would always be there, unchanged by absence, and I would carry the memory with me. The snow was already thick when we turned off the main road, the plowed track giving way to a narrow trail that cut through dense pines. I had been skiing since I could walk, so I was used to winter conditions, but this was different. The air was sharp, almost biting, carrying the scent of frozen earth and resin from the trees. My friends, neither of whom had much experience beyond occasional resort runs, moved cautiously behind me. Their skis slipped and scrunched through the thin crust of ice under fresh snow, and I had to slow down to keep from leaving them behind. We had been chasing the idea of an inexpensive cabin for spring break, far from the crowds and the inflated rates of the popular lodges. Somewhere quiet, isolated, a place we could call our own for a few days. That was the plan, but as the sun dropped toward the horizon, our optimism began to crack. We saw lights first, a dull golden glow through the trees that looked inviting, almost unreal against the deepening blue of the evening. The cabin or lodge, I wasn't sure which, was small, with smoke curling lazily from the chimney. The door was unlocked when we reached it, and as soon as we pushed it open, a warm scent of burning wood and cooking drifted out to meet us. A fire burned steadily in the hearth, and there were plates with what looked like a partially prepared meal on the table. No one was there. No sign of anyone moving around, no shadows in the corners, nothing but the quiet tick of a clock and the dull roar of wind outside. My first thought was that we should leave immediately, that this was some kind of trap, but the storm was building fast. Snowflakes were thickening against the windows, coating the roof in a layer that already looked like it would collapse under its own weight if it kept up. The idea of staying in a warm, sheltered space overcame my hesitation. We settled in, making sure the door was latched behind us. The lodge was small but functional, with a narrow kitchen, a living area dominated by the fireplace, and a loft upstairs that looked like it could hold 2 beds. The wood smelled faintly of smoke and damp pine, and the floor creaked underfoot, the planks warped from age and cold. I unpacked the minimal supplies we had brought, mostly energy bars and extra layers, while my friends explored the small space, cautiously checking the loft and cupboards. There was no sign of anyone else. I tried to focus on the logic of the situation. Maybe the owners had gone into town, maybe they left quickly and meant to return, but that only went so far in the silence. Night fell, and the wind picked up, rattling the windows in a low, persistent groan. Every so often, a branch scraped against the siding, loud and sudden enough to make me jump. Then it started, small noises at first. A door upstairs that creaked as if someone had leaned on it, a drawer sliding open slowly, the soft shuffle of footsteps on the loft floor. My friends heard it too, and I could see them stiffen, frozen in place. We stayed close to the fire, hearts hammering, eyes scanning the dark corners. We knew logically that no one should be there, that the storm would make approaching the cabin nearly impossible, but the noises continued. They moved through the upstairs space in unpredictable intervals, sometimes long stretches of silence followed by another noise so distinct it made us flinch. Eventually, I decided I had to investigate. I moved carefully up the stairs, making sure every footstep was deliberate. The loft was empty, the beds neatly made, and there were no signs of anyone having just been there. The noises didn't stop. They seemed to come from the back of the house, toward the small kitchen and the back door. I opened the door carefully, and the snow hit my face immediately, wet and cold, but there was no one outside. The snow covered every track we had made, except for a set of footprints that led from the back door into the treeline. They were deep and distinct, but no one could be seen moving through the woods. The wind had masked any sound of motion, and the storm was already heavy enough that we couldn't see far. I called my friends to look, but they were too afraid to approach. We stood there for several minutes, silent, watching the storm sweep over the tracks until the wind began to blur them into the snow. Later that evening, one of my friends disappeared. We had been sitting near the fire, wrapped in blankets, trying to ignore the wind and the sound of branches snapping against the cabin. When I turned to check on them, they were gone. Panic rose immediately. I searched the first floor, the loft, every closet, every corner. Nothing. The fire was low, flickering weakly, and the storm seemed louder, closer, as if it were pressing against the walls. I finally ran to the back door, flung it open, and there they were, standing in the snow just past the threshold. Their face was blank, expressionless, and they didn't speak. They didn't move except to stand perfectly still, staring into the treeline. My heart hammered in my chest. I grabbed their arm, shaking them, and they finally turned, eyes clearing slowly, as if waking from a daze. They had no recollection of stepping outside, of the footprints leading into the trees. The The snow clung to their clothes, soaking them through, and I could see the raw red of their fingers against the white snow. They shivered violently, and I pulled them inside immediately. We spent the rest of the night in the living room, huddled near the fire. The storm raged, the wind slamming against the cabin like a drum, and every sound outside made us jump. Every creak, every groan of the old wood felt amplified. Sleep was impossible. Dawn came slowly, gray and heavy, and the storm began to lose some of its strength, though it still drove snow across the small clearing. We stayed close, cautious, reluctant to leave the warmth of the fireplace for even a moment. When the light improved, I decided to investigate again. The footprints were gone, erased completely by fresh snow, leaving only the unbroken white field beyond the back door. It was disorienting, the sudden blankness after a night of fear. We gathered our things, packed efficiently, and made sure the cabin was secure. Nothing had been taken, and nothing had moved inside, but the feeling of being watched lingered as we crossed the threshold. We walked back to the main trail carefully, keeping close to each other. The wind was still strong, but the storm had faded enough that visibility returned gradually. There was no sign of anyone, no tracks but our own. The cabin disappeared behind us, nestled in its clearing, silent and cold. The memory of the night stayed with me, an unshakable tension that made the memory vivid and immediate. The isolation, the storm, the inexplicable movements, and the empty faces of my friend in the snow. It all combined into something that felt like danger, though I couldn't put my finger on what exactly had threatened us. We returned to civilization slowly, taking the longer route that would connect us to the main roads, and the relief was almost overwhelming. The warmth of cars, the hum of engines, and the sight of other people moving purposefully through the snow made every step feel safe. We never spoke much about that cabin afterward, and I avoided that part of the Adirondacks for years. The story of the footprints and the noises never left me. It was not supernatural, not a story of ghosts or monsters, but it was real in a way that made the world feel fragile. That reminded me how quickly isolation and the elements could turn a simple adventure into something tense, unpredictable, and frightening. The clarity of daylight, the warmth of a vehicle, the return to other humans, that was the resolution. We survived, we returned, and the horror was contained in memory, sharp and detailed, a reminder of the precariousness of venturing into the wild when the storm decides it is in control.